Hello, my name is Scott Schrader. I'm the president and program coordinator for the Monroe County Civil War Roundtable in Bloomington, Indiana. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this presentation. Our speaker for this program is Michelle A. Krowl. Michelle is the Civil War and Reconstruction Specialist in the Manuscript Division at the Library of Congress. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of California, Riverside, and a Master of Arts and her PhD in History from the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of several articles and books on topics relating to the Civil War, as well as on Quantico, Virginia, and the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the Library of Congress, she has worked as a library assistant at the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., an assistant professor at Northern Virginia Community College, and is a research assistant for historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. With that introduction, I'll turn things over to our guest to present her program entitled Charles Wellington Reed, The Civil War Through an Artist's Eyes. Welcome, Michelle.
Well, thank you, Scott. All right, let me share my screen here. Okay. All right, so hopefully everybody can see now. And as we said, happy to share my email address, and I have it both at the beginning on this slide as well as an end slide. So if you missed it at the very beginning, not a problem, we'll be coming back to it. So who was Charles Wellington Reed? Born in Charlestown, Massachusetts in 1841, he was a third child of Joseph and Roxana Reed. He had 6 half-siblings from his father's first marriage, but he was only close to his 2 full sisters, Helen and Emma, to whom he wrote frequently during the Civil War. In August 1862, at the age of 21, Reed enlisted as a bugler in the 9th Massachusetts Light Battery, which was an artillery unit. He was described as standing 5'11" tall, weighing approximately 150 pounds, had blue eyes, and light-colored hair. He served in the Union Army from 1862 to 1865 and spent nearly the entire war within a 150-mile radius of Washington, D.C., extending to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in the north and Petersburg, Virginia to the south. He initially served in the defensive works that formed the ring of fortifications around Washington, D.C., which was relatively light duty and allowed him time to sketch. The 9th Massachusetts Light Battery was detailed to the 5th Army Corps of the Army of the Potomac in time to see action in the July 1863 Battle of Gettysburg and subsequently participate in the drive to Richmond in 1864. In November 1864, he received a position as an assistant topographical engineer, where he remained for the rest of the war. Topographical work suited his skills as an artist and also accorded him benefits not available to other frontline soldiers. So let's go ahead and finish Reed's story now so that we can spend the rest of the presentation looking at his illustrations. Reed survived the Civil War and returned to the Boston area to pursue a career as an artist. In December 1869, he married Rebecca Farwell in Boston. They were married for just over 49 years before her death in September 1919. They had no children. From about 1874 to 1880, Reed joined his father-in-law in operating a wholesale liquor and wine store before returning to art full-time and contributing illustrations to a number of publications. Reed was also an avid bicyclist, which is represented in his artistic work, and I just love that dog. Charles Wellington Reed died on April 29, 1926, at the age of 85. He was buried with his wife in her family plot at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As I mentioned, Reed found professional success as an artist, particularly on topics related to the Civil War. In 1888, he co-authored and supplied the illustrations for Bits of Camp Life, a small book of vignettes representing the life of the common soldier. He also contributed illustrations to Horace Porter's Campaigning with Grant, the Century Magazine's famous Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series, as well as other articles. Even close to home, his illustrations featured in Levi Baker's 1888 History of the 9th Massachusetts Battery. Reed's copy of the book is available in his papers at the Library of Congress. However, Reid may be best known for the over 200 illustrations he supplied to John D. Billings's Hardtack and Coffee, or The Unwritten Story of Army Life. And hold on a second, I'm just going to minimize something here. Okay, there we go. Published in 1889. This book is now widely available online. We will see examples of Reid's sketches in Hardtack and Coffee throughout this presentation. So for now, I will just leave you with a projected title illustration that ultimately may have never been used. Not every one of Reid's illustrations in Hardtack and Coffee is included in his papers at the Library of Congress, but a number of them are. At this point, let me say a few words about Reid's illustrations. Not surprisingly, he was more prolific when the war was easier for him and he had time to sketch. This is particularly evident in the letters he sent home to his mother and his sisters. Some illustrations are easy to date, especially those he drew on the dated letters he sent to family and friends. And we will be looking at several examples of these as well. The dates of other drawings can be corroborated by contemporary evidence. The sketch seen here is a case in point. It is captioned, Major General Sickles' headquarters as we passed him going into action on the 2nd of July at Gettysburg, left wing. I took a sketch on the spot. Further corroborating evidence appears in a letter Reid wrote to his mother and sister Helen from Pennsylvania on July 6, 1863. He noted, at the foot of the hill on which we took position was Major General Sickles' headquarters under a tree. We halted here a few minutes, giving me time to take a sketch of him. And as a historian, I wish all illustrations and things were as well dated as that one is. Some drawings Reid completed after the war are identified as having been based on contemporary photographs, or his inspiration is clear by comparing his drawings to known wartime photos. But still other illustrations are undated, and information about the circumstances that led Reid to create them remain unknown. We also know that Reid was left-handed, which was more unusual in the 19th century than today. So how do we know that he was a left-hand artist, left-handed? But you may notice that his handwriting slants to the left. This is very similar to the handwriting style of veterans represented in the William Olin Bourne papers at the Library of Congress, who entered samples of their left-hand penmanship to a contest for soldiers who had lost the use of their right hands during the war. There is also evidence in Reid's own illustrations, such as the one seen here, in which Reid drew an image of himself swatting away flies. If you look closely, you will see that Reid has drawn himself drawing with his left hand. Finally, Reid wrote to a friend in 1864, apologizing for his lack of correspondence after his left hand had become temporarily disabled due to a broken bone. I always use my left hand in writing or drawing, he explained. So to the loss of its use, you must attribute the cause of my not writing you earlier. Over 150 of Reid's illustration Civil War letters to his mother, sister Helen, and his niece Grace are included in the Charles Wellington Reed papers of the Library of Congress. This collection also includes several sketchbooks and other illustrated materials, and is, to the best of my knowledge, the largest single collection of Reid materials. 27 letters Reid wrote to his sister Emma are in a collection in the Princeton University Library. Some correspondence is known to be in private collections. There could be other existing Reid materials from the Civil War era in private hands, as he sometimes gave sketches to other soldiers in exchange for food or other favors. And a last little bit of housekeeping before we get on to the main event. From this point on, unless otherwise noted, all the original materials quoted from or displayed in this presentation are from the Charles Wellington Reed papers in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress. This collection is now available online with full color scans made from the original materials. Illustrations from the published edition of Hardtack and Coffee are from a black and white PDF copy available online through HathiTrust. And finally, for the sake of clarity and visibility, a few of the illustrations have been modified slightly in terms of the brightness and the image contrast settings. Okay, on with the show. A few notable Civil War figures appear in Reid's art. General Ambrose B. Burnside of Rhode Island, whose Civil War career was checkered with tragic missteps, inspired Reid to label him as the bungling blunderer. To the left, Reid noted Burnside's blunders at the Battle of Antietam, North Anna, and the Crater. Interestingly, he omitted the December 1862 Battle of Fredericksburg, which is the action with which most people negatively associate Burnside's name. Most likely, photographs of Burnside inspired Reid's drawing, as we can see the similarity to wartime photos, including this one in the collection of the Prints and Photographs Division of the Library of Congress. Abraham Lincoln appears in at least 2 sketches in the Reid papers. In one, he is greeting troops at City Point in 1865. The accompanying label reads, "The President landing at City Point just as a batch of convalescents are lined up to be sent to the front. Goes up to them, shakes hands with all, thanks them, and praises them for what they have done and about to do. A soldier then greets Lincoln's outstretched hand with, 'Good God, you going to shake with me, Uncle Abe?'" The other sketch depicts a worried-looking Lincoln, wrapped in a shawl, going out for what is labeled a midnight think. I don't know if Reid ever actually saw Lincoln in person, or he drew these solely from descriptions by others or from his own imagination. General Ulysses S. Grant is a recognizable figure in several of Reid's pieces. This illustration of Grant is the one most associated with Reid, and there are several versions of it in his papers. A version of the drawing of Grant on horseback appeared in Horace Porter's Campaigning with Grant and was labeled as General Grant reconnoitering the Confederate position at Spotsylvania Courthouse. The image was also reproduced in G. Norton Galloway's article, Hand-to-Hand Fighting at Spotsylvania, which was published in the Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series in the Century magazine. The Reid papers include at least 3 other sketches of Grant. The image on the left represents Grant at the Wilderness, and this image was used again in the Century. In Charles Carlton Coffin's An Incident of the Wilderness. Reid captured a more lighthearted scene between General Grant and his wife, Julia, over having his photograph taken. And according to the caption at the bottom, it says, "Now you list, let him do it. It's the way he makes his living. It won't take but a minute," Mrs. U.S. Grant said, according to the sketch. In this case, Reid likely did not observe the scene himself, but heard about it and rendered it into a sketch. We do know, however, that photographer Matthew Brady was at City Point, and this could have been the inspiration for Reid's illustration. And finally, a Reid drawing of Grant appears as the frontispiece to Hardtack and Coffee. I don't have a lot of particular commentary on these battle scenes, so we can go through them just to get a sense of how Reid visually recorded battles in his sketches. So there's another little bit rougher. Artillery blast. Interestingly, this is about as violent as Reid tends to get in his battle scenes. Here he shows the soldier in the center being hit by shrapnel from an artillery piece. It's still not clear to me whether Reid rendered Civil War battlefields in a relatively sanitized way to suit the delicate sensibilities of his audiences, or whether this is the way that he preferred to remember the conflict. Either way, his battlefield scenes often have an interestingly bloodless quality to them. Reid illustrated this group of artillerymen using subtle body language that suggests the process of firing an artillery piece. And if this is not explicitly a representation of the 9th Massachusetts Battery, Reid drew similar sketches of his own unit. The war had been relatively easy for Reid up till this point, but once the 9th Massachusetts Battery was detailed to the 5th Army Corps in June 1863, circumstances for Reid and his comrades changed considerably. Gettysburg was his first real taste of combat, and quite a first battlefield experience it was. Gettysburg turned out to be a pivotal point for him, a pivotal event for him in several ways. A month after the battle, he told his mother he, quote, "wouldn't have missed being in the Battle of Gettysburg for $10,000, not a cent less." But he also confessed that, I am not over and about particular about being in another of the same style. Gettysburg served as a source of inspiration for Reed's art during the war and many times again in the future. Now, this is clearly a post-war sketch of a return visit to Little Round Top, since there is a battlefield monument clearly visible in the foreground. But here's another of action on Little Round Top. And here Reed depicts Weinbrenner's Lane at the base of Cemetery Hill. Visible in the distance is the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse, which is one of the most recognizable features or structures on or near the battlefield. Some of Reed's Gettysburg illustrations were clearly intended for publication. This image provides a glimpse into Reed's process with the labeling of landmarks and instructions for printing, as does this close-up of Confederate forces forming prior to Pickett's charge. These illustrations probably were created to accompany an article on Pickett's charge published in the Century in 1887. This is clear when the orientation of the illustration is changed to a horizontal one, and we compare the two previous sketches against the published version. And you can particularly see it in terms of the flags here and some of the landscape. During the Civil War, Reed made professional drawings of scenes involving the 9th Massachusetts at Gettysburg, including this one of the action at the Peach Orchard on July 2nd. While these artistic endeavors may have engaged his creativity, the results also represented a lucrative sideline for him. Reed produced illustrations that he lithographed and sold to other soldiers. He enlisted his mother's help in procuring the lithographs, sending them to the proper recipients, and often dealing with the logistical aspects of the enterprise. This image, it was a bestseller for him, and it depicts 5 battle scenes in which the 9th Massachusetts participated between the opening engagement, which is at the top left, and finally leaving the field on July 5th on the bottom right. Reed executed other sketches for publication and sale, and admitted to his mother in March 1865 that, quote, "I'm going to make some money before I get out of this." Interestingly, the letter Reed sent home after Gettysburg is illustrated, but it is a commercial illustration on printed paper rather than one of Reed's own drawings. As he explained to his mother and his sister, "This sheet of paper I picked up on the battlefield from a knapsack that had been torn to pieces by a shell." So this turns out to be more of a battlefield souvenir. Another popular item was Reed's plan of the Gettysburg battleground, which he submitted for copyright in 1864. He initially produced a copy for his commanding officer to use, then one to send to his mother. But so many soldiers desired their own copies that he found he could get enough subscribers to make the lithography actually pay for itself. Reed's participation in the Battle of Gettysburg also brought him a measure of acclaim in 1895 when he received the Medal of Honor. His former commander, Captain John Bigelow, nominated Reed for risking his own life to save Bigelow's at Gettysburg on July 2nd, 1863. The battery was ordered to hold its position against a Confederate attack to allow time for Union guns to get into position. Reed stayed with Bigelow after the captain was seriously wounded and helped evacuate him to a field hospital, despite the Union artillery barrage being unleashed on the 21st Mississippi. Because Bigelow was unable to ride a horse at a quick gait, the two had to move slowly between the line of fire, which further imperiled the lives of both Reed and Bigelow. Reed first received the medal that you see here on the left. The first design of the Medal of Honor was widely copied by other people making similar medals, rendering the actual Medals of Honor less unique. Thus, the Army's Medal of Honor was redesigned in 1904 to preserve its distinctiveness as the highest honor awarded to soldiers. At that point, the government tried to require veterans who had received the first version to surrender the previous medal. But many veterans felt a sentimental attachment to their initial medals and didn't want to give them up. So a compromise allowed the veterans to keep both medals, so long as they did not wear them at the same time. This explains why Reed's collection contains 2 different Medals of Honor awarded for the same action. One of the great strengths of Reid's art, however, is the depiction of the life of ordinary soldiers. From enlistment to mustering out, Reid captures vignettes of the experience on a human level. In this next series of illustrations, we will see both the original art and often how those images were rendered in the publications for which many were created. These two images suggest the recruitment office as a soldier enlists in the Army. And in the background, you might notice the bounty advertisements on the wall, suggesting that perhaps these men were not entirely motivated to enlist by patriotism alone. After enlistment, this group gathered on Boston Common to say farewell to loved ones. One of the early camps for the 9th Massachusetts was Camp Meigs at the Reedville Barracks in Massachusetts, which Reid later drew from a photograph. A characteristic that I've noticed about Reid's depictions of camps is that they mostly tend to look orderly, serene, and fairly inviting. Like his largely bloodless battlefield scenes, it adds charm to the illustrations, but the reality of camp life was certainly dirtier and more chaotic than what he usually represents. Reid's illustrations show the huge variation in the types of tents and shelters encountered by soldiers in the field. In this grouping, we see the larger Sibley tents with the tall profiles. Reid also shows us interior views to suggest how the tent was heated and how the smoke was drawn out of the top. And again, charming little dog that's greeting the guy coming out of the tent or barking furiously at him, hard to tell which. The author of Hardtack and Coffee also explains that 4 men were usually assigned to a larger A tent, but that up to 6 men could find themselves sharing accommodations. Thus, spooning became necessary in those tight quarters, and it was, quote, "It was rather necessary to comfort that all should turn over at the same time." Most soldiers in the field would immediately recognize the even more basic dog tent seen here. A sketch of an improvised shelter near Petersburg, Virginia depicts an even more primitive protection from the elements. This sketch may have been inspired by Reid's own experiences in this location in June 1864, when he recorded in his diary, "In position on the Jerusalem road, still intolerably warm, can neither read, write, or take sketches." Reid's illustrations often indicate at a glance the type of weather being experienced by the tent's occupants. The soldiers in the illustration on the right have built a foliage arbor to protect the tent and themselves from the sun. It is definitely summer in this illustration, captioned right under the illustration itself. "You see, we live upstairs now." Attached to this letter is a description of the weather that the illustration doesn't quite do justice. "It is terrible warm here. Breathing acts like a pump on the system, and ham fat exudes from our pores in a refined state, trickling down our faces and backs in true style. Not much fun about it, I assure you." This wartime drawing provided the inspiration for a later published piece. While the cute horses and trees in the background have been replaced by other soldiers in bare accommodations for the Hardtack and Coffee sketch, we can definitely see the origin for the shelter in the center. The bare tent held up by tree limbs, the soldier on his back reading the newspaper with one leg draped over the edge, the tent pole providing a hanger for caps and pouches. And then here is the finished result. Then, as now, summer in Virginia means heat and insects, which are on view in this illustration. Reid explained to his mother that, quote, "I should have answered earlier, but the intolerable hot weather almost entirely precludes the idea of writing." And he and his comrades, furthermore, were, quote, "growing desperate over our futile attempts to drive away the myriads of flies which infest this region and bite equally as fierce as mosquitoes, who also, by the way, favor us at night with their reviving melodies." Likewise, winter quarters are easy to spot in Reid's drawings. This illustration sent to his mother in February 1863 shows footprints in the snow, the gathering of firewood, and stovepipes coming out of the tents, which are elevated on more solid foundations of logs that provided additional shelter from the elements. Reid drew numerous interior views of these accommodations, which usually include the log sides, wood flooring, a stove for warmth, and some of the comforts of home. Bedding periodically comes up in Reid's letters to his family, perhaps to assure them of his level of comfort. These two illustrations from fall 1862 show that Reid had time to make a bedstead out of boards. Once filled with straw and covered with a rubber blanket, he explained that it makes a very convenient seat, couch, and lounge. A letter to his sister in January 1863 provides another glimpse of his homey interior at Fort Ramsey and more description about the fabrication of his bed. "Oh, we live high, if we do sleep low. Not so low, though, for we have a bunk 18 inches from the floor, plenty of straw and blankets to make it comfortable." This letter also reflects Reid's sense of humor as conveyed artistically. In referencing their recent calamities, the expression of it is "our recent calamities," with the accompanying clamshell drawn. So yes, you might say that Reid developed his own Civil War emojis. Likewise, a request to the folks at home for a new hat included sketches of the style and features that he wanted. Reid's illustrations often record the weather, which was understandably of prime interest to soldiers in the field. We've already seen some illustrations suggestive of the heat and the cold, but the rain in Virginia and the corresponding mud often comes up in Reid's letters home. In this October 1862 letter, precipitation kept Reid inside his tent, but he claimed on this occasion to not mind, as the rain has settled the abominable dust. Rain and snow were more of a trial when the regiment was on the move, as in the illustration on the left, in which the unit gets drenched in rain on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. In bitterly cold weather, Reid had to be concerned not only about his own comfort, but also that of his horse. In November 1862, he apologized to his sister for not writing, explaining that, quote, "I should have replied that evening, but it was too cold. The next day it snowed all day to an average depth of 4 inches, and strong wind prevailing at the same time made it bitter cold. Our poor horses suffered much, being in the open air with only a blanket on, and that the wind would blow off occasionally. I managed with the aid of bits of rope to keep mine on." Serving as a bugler required Reid to be outside and subjected to the elements in order to issue the appropriate bugle calls during the day. In the sketch on the left, he is doing his duty in a driving rain. The rains, of course, made the camp soggy and unpleasant, as suggested by the pooling water in the illustration on the right. Rain turned the earth into mud. Reid complained bitterly and frequently about the Virginia mud, including in September 1864 during the siege of Petersburg. "Have been wet to the skin for days, have slept in mud, stood in the mud, kneeled in the mud to avoid shells, worked in the mud, rode in the mud, been splattered with mud from head to foot, with mud by shot and shell, and drank muddy water. Altogether, we have had a nasty time of it." Apart from the impact of the weather on a soldier's personal comfort, it affected his health and the strength of the unit as a whole. "The changes in the weather here are exceedingly sudden, making it impossible to be prepared for it at all times," Reid wrote. "There are a great many sick in this vicinity, all on account of lying in such close proximity to the damp ground." In October 1863, Reid described how he and his comrades adapted to the inclement weather. "The rain has commenced to beat through my shelter. We have a flooring of boards, raised a little from the ground, so our bedding of hay and clothing will not get wet. Then with our gum blankets, we cover everything over so that what rain does sprinkle through don't trouble us much. What is most inconvenient is being obliged to remain crouched up in our small quarters all day, for we have only 2 positions to choose from, which are these. You see, we don't have much room to circulate in." In addition to shelter, food played a significant role in the life of a soldier, and Reid's artwork documents this as well. In scenes such as these, he depicts the soldiers communally cooking their rations over small fires. The soldier in the illustration at the top left is frying hardtack, which perhaps not surprisingly was included in Hardtack and Coffee. For those of you not familiar with hardtack, Reid has kindly provided a drawing of it, although the illustration may make it look more edible than it often was. As it is described in the book, it was a plain flour and water biscuit measuring about 3 by 3 inches and ½ inch thick. So not sounding so bad so far. But they often became hard as rocks and were practically inedible, especially without fear of losing some teeth in the process. They weren't much softer when wet and instead frequently became moldy. Weevils and maggots had better luck with them, but that too didn't make them any more appealing to the soldiers. But the soldiers employed creative cooking in trying to make the hardtack palatable, like the soldier on the previous slide who was frying it. In addition to the individual soldiers and tent mates fending for themselves with rations, there were cooks who provided additional meals at the mess. Reid sketched these scenes, adding a bit of humor in one, with a sign above the entrance to the mess, which read Delmonico's, which was one of the most famous restaurants in New York City. But everything tastes better with ketchup, and that was the case during the Civil War as well. Reid sketched a group of men eating army hash and passing around a bottle of ketchup. The last of Mr. Hudson's famous ketchup with a famous army hash, the caption reads. Unfortunately, not even ketchup could save this soldier's dinner, his Thanksgiving dinner of which consisted of raw pork and hardtack. Some Thanksgiving dinner, reads this caption. Not surprisingly, left to their own devices, soldiers foraged for supplements to their diets. This illustration in Bits of Camp Life could have been inspired by Reid's own experiences, which he described to his mother in July 1863 while stationed in Warrenton, Virginia. We are encamped on a very pleasant spot and live on the fat of the land. A couple of us go out to some of the rich farmers, always secesh, and generally find game in the shape of sheep, lambs, pigs, chickens, etc., and therefore a jolly time. One of us holds the horses while the other dismounts, singles out his game, and takes a shot with our revolvers, which is the best use we can put them to at present. The little pig in the previous illustration makes another appearance at the start of a chapter in Hardtack and Coffee about foraging. The first letter of the chapter is rendered with an illustration, and the T in there includes a pig who has caught the attention of the forager in the background. But I must confess to being a little more partial to an earlier sketch in which the armed forager has not come on the scene, and we just get to see the cute little pigtail. Reid is excellent at capturing other aspects of soldiers' life, including the importance of contact with the home front. The sending and receiving of mail was a lifeline to the folks back home, and Reid frequently mentioned the letters he received when writing to his family. Several of the sketches that begin his letters depict him in the act of responding to correspondence. It took all the afternoon to get settled here. I have just had supper and enjoyed a cigarette, and am now writing you on a barrelhead. Receiving care packages also brought joy to camp, in addition to filling the recipient's stomachs. I received your box and mother's at the same time. You'll never know what pleasure it is to receive a box out here in the Army. I can't describe it. Nobody can. You must experience it to know it. I do so wish you could have seen the gusto with which we duffed into that turkey and fixins. On occasion, the after-dinner entertainment may have included making shadow puppets on the tent wall using the light of a candle behind the soldiers. Animal power provided transportation and haulage for Civil War armies, and the animals could occasionally get bulky. Hopefully, ABC Clements learned not to walk behind a horse again after he was kicked in the jaw and lost some of his teeth. Reid's papers include another sketch of Clements at the Wilderness, but since the first sketch isn't dated, it's hard to tell if in this one he still has all of his teeth. But The illustration of the horse that kicked Clements echoes the composition in a hardtack and coffee sketch, in which a cook is kicked off of a pontoon bridge by a recalcitrant horse or mule. But we'll give the good old army mule the last kick on this slide. But most of the horses that Reid depicts are really delightful. They typically are prancing, they're patient, they're docile, or they are steadfast and dependable, and not just waiting around to kick someone's teeth out or buck them off of a bridge. And the way that Reid discusses his own horse in his correspondence makes clear his fondness for horses. In an 1862 letter, Reid captured an aspect of Civil War medical care not often discussed, particularly in letters home. Disease was a tremendous problem for the Army, and Reid included an illustration of inoculations in camp with the comment that the brigade surgeon was here today and went through a thorough vaccination of the whole battery, officers and all. So we are all right in that line. I suspect that the inoculation was probably for smallpox, but Reid doesn't specify that that's the case. If anyone is squeamish about the dentist, you might want to cover your eyes and ears for the next couple of minutes, because Reid is about to have some dental work done. These painful looking sketches were likely inspired by an event in Reid's own life when he had to have a tooth extracted in 1862. And this time I actually am quoting a letter from Reid to his sister Emma, which is included at the collection at Princeton University rather than the Library of Congress. But it is just so evocative and explanatory of the look on the soldier's face in this sketch that I couldn't not include it. So he wrote, "Day before yesterday, I went to the hospital, endured the painful operation of having my tooth pulled. The surgeon was decidedly rough, telling one man to hold my head and me to sit still, as he was in a hurry to eat his dinner. The tooth broke at the first pull and the roots had to be dug out. My mouth was lacerated in a fearful manner. You would have thought 3 teeth had been drawn, at least from appearances." Initially, a visit to the camp barber looked similarly traumatic, as if a scene from Sweeney Todd was about to commence. But fortunately for the soldier getting a shave with a straight razor, Reid's finished sketch looks decidedly more civilized and serene. Methods of punishment for infractions come into play in a few of Reid's drawings. In 1863, he sent his sister Helen a letter containing a sketch of a prisoner fitted with a ball and chain. While he doesn't explicitly say that the prisoner in the sketch is the same man he discusses in the letter, who was likely to be hanged for the murder of 7 men, presumably the sketch complements the description. For hardtack and coffee, Reid sketched other forms of punishment, including having to wear signs announcing one's crime, carrying a log on one's back, and being bucked and gagged. A preliminary sketch shows a prisoner bucked, but not yet gagged. Perhaps all this yelling in the draft led to his successor being gagged in the final version. These soldiers, on the other hand, got to experience the joys of being on furlough, including time spent with the objects of their affection. While this next drawing does not carry the label furlough, as do the other two, the tender scene is quite similar. Except this couple has company in the form of a peeping Tom hiding in the bushes. Finally, this illustration is not exactly a vignette of camp life or a soldier's experiences in the same way as the others we've seen, but I wanted to include it nonetheless. Few of Reid's illustrations in the collection at the Library of Congress include African Americans. This is one of the exceptions, and it depicts contrabands coming in at Laurel Hill in Virginia. Very briefly, the term contrabands was applied to escaped slaves after a precedent set in May 1861 of Union military authorities accepting enslaved persons into Union lines as quote-unquote contraband of war. Military disruption to communities in the Confederacy, government confiscation policies, and the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 encouraged increasing numbers of the enslaved to emancipate themselves by escaping to Union lines. And this quiet sketch of Reid's illustrates that transformational phenomenon during the war. So this is just a small sampling of the illustrations included in the Charles Wellington Reed papers at the Library of Congress. And it is just the tip of the iceberg of the ways in which the American Civil War can be viewed through the eyes of this extraordinary and talented artist. I hope this has whetted your appetite to explore Reed's work for yourself. The collection has been digitized and is available free of charge on the Library of Congress website. Now, having said that it's available on the website, I thought it might be worth a few minutes to walk you through how to find these, since some of you may not have used the library's digital collections before. So there are numerous ways to access the library's online collections, one of which is just to visit our homepage at loc.gov. From there, you can click on Digital Collections to open a page featuring many of our online resources. On the Digital Collections page, you can browse through thumbnail descriptions of online offerings to see what might be of interest to you. Or you can use the facets on the left navigation bar to choose just the parameters in which you are interested. For example, click on Manuscript Division in the Part Of section to narrow your results down just to the collections that are housed in the Manuscript Division. As you can see, you can also refine your results by subject, other parts of the library, whatever you're interested in. It also will be helpful for you to remember that the collections are alphabetized by the first letter of the collection's title, not by the surname of the individual, as is usual practice. As you see here, the Aaron Copland collection is alphabetized A for Aaron, not C for Copland. Thus, for Charles Wellington Reed, you'll find him under C for Charles. Clicking on the thumbnail image for the Charles Wellington Reed papers, or any of the other on the digital collections page, will open the online presentation itself, which includes not only access to the collection images themselves, but also a related resources bibliography, and in the articles and essays section, a timeline of Reed's life and an essay on the Medal of Honor. You can also find the collection through the Library of Congress online catalog. A keyword search for Charles Wellington Reed yields a variety of relevant sources, including the collection of his papers, which is listed in the #1 position here on the screen. Clicking on that option will open the catalog record for this collection. In the links section at the top, the first line is a link to the online presentation. Below that are links to the collection finding aid. The finding aids are available in both HTML and PDF formats. Both versions will provide access to the online material, so feel free to use whichever version suits you best. The advantage of using the collection finding aid is that you can see the options presented in a more linear way than the collection items tab on the presentation. And honestly, I've never figured out the algorithm that arranges and sorts the collection items on the presentations. Especially for large collections, or when you're looking for something specific, the finding aid can be the easier way to navigate. The digital collection links, the digital content available links in the finding aid will open the group of materials. Clicking on these links will open what we call an object record for that group of materials. And clicking on the image at the top, which indicates how many images are in this group, will open a gallery view of the images. Clicking on any of the items will then open a file for that specific image. Single image is the default view, but you can use this drop-down menu to choose other viewing options, such as in slideshow mode, and this can be helpful if you're trying to go through material quickly. But single image is the most versatile view, as from this page, you can change the view mode, access the buttons that allow you to zoom in and out on the image, rotate it, or clip an image on the screen. You can download the image in several different file formats, and you can go forwards and backwards in a sequence of images. So learning how these presentations operate may take a little practice and clearly quite a bit of clicking, but there are whole worlds of resource possibilities just awaiting you there. So at this point, I will close and offer myself up to answer any questions. But as you can see on the screen, if you need help or have reference questions or need other assistance, you can always ask a librarian at the Library of Congress at ask.loc.gov, and your question will be routed to the appropriate staff member to answer it. Or if you have follow-up questions for me, there's my email address, which is mkrowl@loc.gov. So I'll stop sharing now, and then Scott can direct any questions that we might have.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, Michelle, for that talk. It was wonderful. And just so you know, and I know you're aware that I've used the LOC site before to do research, and I already learned a couple things about that slide view versus just the single view. So that would have been helpful to know a while back. But anyway,
yeah, and
I know it now.
Well, I will mention about slideshows, since you mentioned that, is, particularly if you're going through, sometimes on some of our collections, they can be presented at the level of a microfilm reel, and that can be 1,000 images, which is a lot to go through. So that can help you go through a little bit more speedily. But unfortunately, when you're on slideshow mode, you can't zoom in and out of an image. So when you're working with manuscript materials, sometimes, the print can be this big or the letters, and so that can be a drawback to slideshow mode. So I will let you know that you cannot zoom in and out on slideshow.
Very good. I'm going to go ahead and start out with our first question here is from John. And John says, Reid seems to have had some kind of formal training, and it wasn't just another plain or folk painter. Can you tell us a little something about his artistic training?
Well, I don't think we actually know a whole lot about his artistic training. I don't think he went to, formal training or art school. I don't know if maybe he apprenticed with someone. I mean, his enlistment paper says that he was a student at the time that he enlisted, but the editor of his letters also says that he was a lithographer. So whether he had any formal training as an artist, or whether maybe he apprenticed to a lithographer and sort of learned some of the process, that's a little bit less clear. But he's very talented regardless.
Absolutely. And that was a question that I had actually was, he was obviously an artist that was including illustrations with his letters. But in your experience with various manuscripts that you've come across, how common was it for soldiers to put little sketches in along with the letters that they would write home, even if they didn't have his artistic talent?
Trying to think on some of the ones that we have, it doesn't come up very often. There's a few I can think of. There's a couple, I think it's in the David Dixon Porter papers, where someone has I think he's talking about, he's got a bug up his nose, or he's sick or something, and he literally draws a side view with a bug going up his nose. I'm laughing because there's a rude drawing that I won't describe in a family venue, but involves a camel. But in any event, so not often do people draw, particularly not to the level that Reid did, and not as consistently either. That you might draw a little sketch, or sometimes people include battlefield scenes, or kind of sketch something out, maybe a map or something. But for the most part, at least in the collections that I remember seeing at the library, I haven't seen a whole lot of sketches, and definitely not to that level, and definitely not necessarily illustrating what they're writing about too.
Well, I mean, that was one of the things that I really appreciated about his work too, is, we see a lot of the illustrations of battle scenes and things that we've seen after the war, but I really was interested in the day-to-day camp life stuff that he illustrated and that he talked about in those letters. And for those that have not read a lot of Civil War soldier letters, I almost find that more interesting than I do the battle stuff. There's lots of reports on battles and other ways to get that, but his description of the day-to-day life I found just fascinating.
Well, and other than, I mean, there's quite a few wartime illustrators that are they're professional artists that go out and do drawing, the Woads and some of them, and we have a lot of those collections at the Library of Congress as well, and they can include camp scenes, they can include things that are of interest to a national audience that may work, turn into a woodcut drawing that then is published. But the thing that it's lovely about Reid is that he's not only an excellent artist in capturing this, battlefield scenes and other things, but he's also living that experience as well in a way that a professional artist, battlefield artist, or kind of journalistic artist may not be living quite the same way. And he's also, and as you say, I mean, he draws the sort of charming side of camp life and just some of the mundane things about shelters and horses and getting inoculated and food and things of that sort. So that's what I've always found attractive about this collection, is not only the content of his letters, but also the variety of scenes that he's portraying. And I have a suspicion that, I like to talk about Reid because I don't think he's as well known of an artist as some of the other, professional artists that come out of the war. And part of that may also be because he's illustrating his letters and his sketchbooks are in a collection in the manuscript division. They're not in prints and photographs. And so, and I fall into this too, that when I'm looking for an illustration for something, I often first go to prints and photographs division, because they're more easily keyword searchable and they have a lot more things that are scanned. But because if you're thinking visuals, well, yeah, prints and photographs would be your natural first stop. And I don't know if as many people know about looking at other divisions or other kinds of materials to find those visuals. So that's where, I hope the more we can get the word out about Reid, and the fact that the collection is digitized. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's not indexed, so you can't just go find out, okay, what are all the scenes of Gettysburg? That's something I kind of want to do just for myself, if for nothing else. But it's, the other thing is, they're copyright free, they're scanned from the original, they're great illustrations, and they illustrate a lot of things that some of the other, major wartime artists don't necessarily get to.
Yeah. We have another question here from Leanne, who asks, obviously a lot of these illustrations were sent through letters to home, to family, and so forth. And she asks, how long would it have taken, if you know, and I'm sure this is going to change from place to place, but how long would it have taken for that letter to get home? I always find that interesting too. Would they have been reading something about this battle beforehand and then they get a letter from him later? How long did it usually take for that mail to arrive to where he lived?
Well, that's actually a good question for where he is. I mean, sometimes I'm very struck by how quick the mail service actually is in the 19th century, because obviously, unlike us who have, we've got emails and Zoom calls, and we can do all of these other forms of communication, and people aren't sending letters quite as much. And well, we won't even get to what's happening with mail service right at the moment, but in the 19th century, that is your primary form of communication, unless you're going to take the expense to send a telegraph. So sometimes you'd have a couple of mail deliveries during the day, and once you got trains, that mail service could go a little bit faster too. So, but it may depend on where you are in the field as well. I would suspect that Reid's letters probably didn't take that long, because his family is up in Massachusetts and he's down in Virginia, somewhere between Petersburg and Gettysburg the whole time. So he's near major transportation lines. He's near, metropolitan areas with DC. So, and if they're getting mail service fairly regularly, so it might take a day or two, I would imagine, as opposed to if you're in the Western Theater somewhere, it could take a little bit longer. And I'm also very struck, and maybe somebody else has done research on this, I'd love to find out, is I'm also struck by the things that they get sent in the mail. That he mentioned something about, I wish you could see how we, tucked into that turkey and fixins. And all I can think of is, God, how do you pack a turkey and fixins that you send off to, your soldier down in, outside of DC, without it getting putrid or without it spilling all over the place, or, so I'd love to know if somebody's done research on how you send foodstuffs through the mail in the Civil War period, because he's not the first one who said that kind of thing. And, about and these aren't preserved either for the most part. So I'm always fascinated by what's getting sent through the mail there too. But but sometimes things wouldn't necessarily arrive quite on time. There's a whole nother collection, which is also online through the manuscript division, and it's called the John Carval Arnold papers. And Arnold was another soldier in the Army of the Potomac, and who was serving mostly in the Eastern Theater. And what's interesting about that collection is that it's his letters home, and the soldiers' letters tend to survive more than the letters from home to the soldiers for a variety of reasons. But we do have some of the letters that his wife sent to him. Now, she's illiterate, and so anytime she wants to write a letter to her husband, she has to get a neighbor or someone else who can write for it, and that becomes a point of contention between the two, because he writes her letters, and he even writes out the alphabet to try to help her learn her letters so that she can write more quickly to him. And so he'll complain that she isn't writing enough, and she complains, well, I can't just sit down and write you a letter anytime I want to. And so there's a little contention. And at one point, he doesn't get letters as abundantly or quickly as he thinks he ought to. And so he says something along the lines of, well, I was going to stop writing you, but then we heard that a guerrilla attack on a train took the mail car. So I'm just going to assume your letter is on that, and I'll keep writing you. And so obviously, sometimes mail went astray for a variety of reasons there too.
We have another question from John, who says, Reid lived to a ripe old age. Did he attend many Civil War reunions? And if so, did he sketch any of the older veterans or those times at the reunions?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know how often he went. I'm sure he did, because I think he was also part of the local of a local GAR group post in his area, and he was also very because he continued to sketch then, and the war was still part of his life on that score. So I don't know how many national reunions he might have gone to, or to what extent he was getting together with a lot of veterans. But from what I recall in the collection, I don't think there's a lot of sketches of later reunions or photographs of that nature. Now you may have been many of the sketches we have in the collection may date from a lot later, obviously from battles and leaders of the Civil War and some of those others, but I don't recall him sketching reunions or those kind of things. So
we have another question and comment from Steve. He says, thanks for an excellent presentation. Many years ago, I got the book Eye of the Storm by Robert Knox Sneeden, another prolific soldier artist. If you know of his work, how does it compare and contrast to Reid's?
So from what I remember of the Sneeden drawings, is it's less people and more maps and places. I have to confess, I actually have a copy of Eye of the Storm in my library too, and it's been a while since I pulled it out. And lately, and partially I tend to come across Sneeden a little bit more often, because when the Library of Congress first started putting things online, we had an agreement with what was then the Virginia Historical Society to host digital images of Sneeden maps on the geography and map site for the Library of Congress. So you can still find some of those maps there. And even though the originals are now, I guess it's called now the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. But so sometimes when I'm looking for a Civil War map and I go on that site, I find so many great Sneeden maps, and I always think, oh, I wish we did have those. But again, my recollection is that Sneeden does more topography and more illustrations of places and less about the people, if I'm remembering correctly. And what you notice more about Reid is that sometimes there, obviously he's doing landscapes in terms of the battles and things of that sort. He doesn't do as many of buildings, and it's a lot more about people. And so that's how I would say. The other thing about the difference with Sneeden's work is that he uses such vibrant colors too, that if you look at Sneeden, that and you can kind of see in some of them that anytime he's using something that might have been like a purple or a red, because of the composition of the ink, it spreads a little bit more. But his illustrations and his maps are just absolutely gorgeous, and they're very colorful, and they include a lot of detail. Whereas with Reed's, at least in our collection and from what I've seen of his materials, that it's, you know, sometimes pen and ink, a lot of pencil. And the only thing I really recall seeing of his that's in color are, you know, some of those illustrations from bits of camp life. So, but also what we may have in our collections, you know, again, they're letters home, and sometimes they're kind of preliminary sketches for things. So that may have impacted the final result too.
I had a question too, and you sort of addressed it with your last response. I was curious about, you know, what materials did Reid typically use to do his drawings? You had mentioned pencil, ink. There may be different things, but I'll kind of follow that up since you already answered the one I had. How did he get his supplies? I mean, was that something they found at a sutler, or did he have to carry that with him, or where would he have gotten the art supplies?
I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I read, well, and I should, even though Library of Congress employees aren't supposed to endorse products, I should let you know. So just as me, this is a book. It's called A Grand Terrible Drama, and it was edited by Eric Campbell, who's a National Park Service ranger. He went through and edited, transcribed a lot of the excerpts from the Reid letters at the Library of Congress, also from that Princeton collection, also from a couple in private hands, and did a lot of research on Reid too. And it's been a little while since I read through all the excerpts in the book, so I can't quite remember whether Reid ever talks about where he's getting his art supplies. Because sometimes in soldiers' letters, they're, well, and Reid does this too, obviously, that they ask for things from home that they either can't get at the sutler, or it's expensive, or they know that their families will send. So often, you know, he's asking for a hat, and the one that I showed tonight, but but other soldiers will ask, I'm running out of paper, I'm running stamps, particularly, I'm running out of stamps. Can you send me this? I didn't like that. So I don't know whether Reid is doing that same. I can't remember if he's asking for, you know, pens or pencils or various supplies. But also he, you know, being the bugler, what he also may have been able to do, and this is part of what I mentioned, is that sometimes he could trade things for his sketches. So, you know, if he was running out of paper or running out of something, he might have been able to trade it for something, for a sketch. And then obviously once he gets into the topographical core, then, you know, he probably had more regular access. But yeah, it's a good question, you know, to what extent he was ever running out of things and either had to trade for it or purchase it, or, you know, had them sent from home.
Very good. That looks like that's the last of our questions. So I think we'll wrap up there for tonight. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. And your presentation.
Well, it was my pleasure, and I enjoyed meeting all of you. And as we said earlier in the program, if you've come up with follow-up questions that I didn't answer, or you didn't think of at the time, or you run into trouble when you're on the Library of Congress website and need some help or some reference assistance, feel free to send me an email.
Okay, thanks again. And for all our viewers, we thank you for participating, and we hope you'll join us next time for our next Monroe County Civil War Roundtable presentation. Thank you all very much.